When it comes to basketball legends, you can't do much better than Detroit, a city that has produced NBA legends and Hall of Fame superstars. So ask yourself the question, who's the greatest basketball player ever to come out of Detroit? Is it Chris Webber of Detroit Country Day, a number 1 overall draft pick of the Orlando Magic, who went on to play 15 seasons in the NBA? Is it Spencer Haywood of Detroit Pershing, an NBA Hall of Fame legend who won a championship in 1980 with the Los Angeles Lakers? Is it Derek Coleman of Detroit Northern, a number 1 overall draft pick of the New Jersey Nets, who averaged 20 points and 10 rebounds a game? Is it Jalen Rose of Detroit Southwestern, part of Michigan's Fab Five, who played 13 seasons in the NBA before joining ABC and ESPN? Or is it George Iceman Gervin of Detroit Martin Luther King Jr., a scoring machine for the San Antonio Spurs, who was voted one of the 50 greatest players in NBA history? No. The greatest basketball player ever produced by the city of Detroit is a player you've never heard of. Someone who didn't spend 1 minute playing major college basketball. Someone who didn't spend 1 minute in the NBA. His name is Curtis Jones, and he was better than all of them. Better than Chris Webber. Better than Derek Coleman. Better than the Iceman. In the 1960s and 70s, Curtis Jones was the king of the court in the Motor City. Playing at the famed St. Cecilia Gym on Detroit's west side, Curtis played with and against the greatest players of his generation, and more than 4 decades later, they all remember him like it was yesterday.
We played against each other down in St. Cecilia's, and I think, we knew each other. So I think he had a great deal of respect for me, as I did for him. And I wasn't one of those pros that say, you're not even at the college level, so I'm not even going to concern myself with you. He was a guy that could play, and he could fit in, and any scorer wanted Kurt on their team because he was going to get them the ball. Curtis was before his time. He was not 6 feet. He's real thin, maybe 150, 60 pounds at best, but he was a magician with the basketball. Curtis could penetrate and pass better than anybody that I think I've seen in a long, long time. He was fun to watch. Not fun to play against, but fun to watch.
This is the story of a legend, a 5'9" basketball wizard who was so fast that he could go the entire length of the court in just 3 dribbles. A basketball magician whose ball handling and passing would have you saying, "Did I just see what I think I just saw?" The old-timers will tell you that Curtis Jones had more basketball talent than any of the other Detroit legends. But his dreams died, and his future was destroyed for one reason. Curtis Jones couldn't read. He might have been the best basketball player in Detroit history, one of the most amazing talents the sport has ever seen, but Curtis Jones couldn't read or write his own name. He was allowed to graduate from high school. He was even able to attend college, even though nobody ever taught him to read or write. And when you fail at that, you fail at everything. This is the incredible story of Curtis Jones, the greatest basketball talent Detroit has ever seen. The best there ever was. The best there never was. The legend of Curtis Jones really began to explode in the winter of 1967, when he was a junior at Northwestern High School. Everybody in the city knew who he was, But that season, he became a basketball god.
Curtis and I started playing against each other when we were 10 years old. So my first memories of him is as a competitor, because usually I guarded Curtis and Curtis guarded me because we happened to be the best players usually on our teams. One thing we used to we called him maybe pocket magic. I mean, he was magic before magic. He was a smaller version. And then, you think about the fact that, his ball handling, his wizardry, he was Isaiah before Isaiah.
In February of 1967, Curtis Jones took part in the most famous high school basketball game in Michigan history, undefeated Detroit Northwestern versus undefeated Detroit Pershing. Both teams were loaded. In addition to Curtis Jones, Northwestern had a big, strong forward named John Mayberry, who later became a star in Major League Baseball, and they were coached by Fred Snowden, who went on to become a Division I college coach at Arizona. But Detroit Pershing was even more loaded. That team featured two NBA superstars, Spencer Haywood and Ralph Simpson, and they had a legendary coach of their own in Will Robinson. So on February 21st, 1967, the game tipped off. With more than 1,000 fans filling every square inch of the gym, Northwestern took on mighty Pershing. The game went back and forth all night. With the game tied at 61 and the clock winding down, Curtis Jones took the ball and dribbled to the top of the key. Just 2 seconds before the final buzzer sounded, he let fly with a jumper that found nothing but the bottom of the net. Final score, 63-61. Northwestern had beaten mighty Pershing, and it was Curtis Jones who led the way.
Mayberry, Lamont, Kurt, a couple other guys, they're pretty damn good too. But this is Ralph Simpson and Spencer Haywood we're dealing with. Somehow they keep it close, back and forth, and 5 seconds, 10 seconds, in the last 10 seconds of the game, Kurt, who had probably 20 assists if they were counting it, I don't think he had taken a shot in the whole game. If he did, he was like 0 for 3. And he gets the ball, he makes his little move, and he pushes off. And you can ask anybody our age, everybody remembers it. He pushes off, steps back, shoots a foul line jumper, boom. And they win by 2. And they beat Haywood and Simpson, which is the only game they lost that year.
Spencer Haywood was destined for NBA greatness, but that night he was outdone by the magical guard from Northwestern. And even though he played in more than 800 games during his pro career, Spencer Haywood remembers every detail of that game.
It was televised on Channel 50. All of our games were televised on Channel 50. We kicked the Pistons off TV. He was just a phenomenal player. He was like for young players that want to know what it was like. I mean, the stuff that Magic Johnson did as a player, Curtis Jones was the first player to do it, but not that kind of size, but he had the skill set to do all of those things. He was just incredible. In fact, I hate to say it, but they beat us for the city championship in 1967, although we won the state Class A champions. For the first time, Detroit Public School had won it in 35 years, but we had to get past Northwestern.
The next day, Curtis Jones' picture was on the front page of the Detroit Free Press sports section. The kid from Northwestern was the king of the city. And what was even more amazing was his stat line from that game. Just 2 points and an unbelievable 25 assists. Curtis Jones knew that you didn't need to score to dominate the game.
We valued at that young age, how many points did we score? I outscored Curtis, whereas Curtis understood, 10 points, 10 rebounds, 10 assists translated to what you're trying to do individually, plus it got my teammates involved. And I think we all came to that understanding later. Curtis had it right away. I mean, he was a genius in that way.
A genius in that way. A genius. Yes, when it came to basketball, Curtis Jones was indeed a genius. The people who grew up with him say that even though he was born with a gift to play basketball, nobody worked harder at it than Curtis Jones did. Every day, all year round, Curtis would dribble a basketball from his home on McGraw Street, all the way to downtown Detroit. He would dribble down there with his right hand and dribble back with his left hand. 4 miles each way, every day. As his mother Henrietta would say many years later, basketball was his only interest. You couldn't force a book in his hand. You couldn't take a basketball out of it. If Curtis Jones' legend was born in that 1967 game against Pershing, his legacy was made at a place called St. Cecilia's, a tiny gym in Detroit that was the center of the basketball universe in the 1960s and 70s.
A place in New York, a place in Philadelphia, a place in Washington, D.C., and that's where all the good players went to play and to compete. St. Cecilia was that place in Detroit.
The Saints is a very historical place here in Detroit, not only in basketball, but also throughout the community. There's so many names. You can go from George Gervin, Dave Bing, Campy Russell, Tony Fuller, Terry Furlow, Spencer Haywood, Ralph Simpson. They all started here in the city of Detroit. Bubba Hawkins, Eric Money, Benny White. There you can go on, including Curtis Jones.
The St. Cecilia games back during those times contained 3 or 4 either pro players currently or guys who went on to play. That's how talent rich the rosters were. When Irvin Johnson came to play at St. Cecilia, he wasn't a pro, he was still in high school. But obviously was the guy who was going to become one of the top players to ever play basketball in the world. That was what the rosters were like. So Curtis Jones was, again, probably the best guard that you'd see play during those games, would be very impactful to his team's success during those games, and was just, when the word was out that his team was going to play at 4 o'clock, the gym was packed at 4 o'clock.
On weekend nights, St. Cecilia would be packed to the rafters to see the big stars take the court. Every seat filled, with even more spectators standing shoulder to shoulder lining the court. Among the regulars in the late 1970s was a little boy who went to grade school at St. Cecilia, a kid named Jalen Rose.
Kurt Jones is on a different level. Kurt Jones is the neighborhood version that we had that's a cross between Magic Johnson and George Gervin. I remember being in the gym and Derek Coleman basically grabbed me in the headlock and was like, "You know who that is?" Like, "That's Kurt Jones." He was like, Kurt Jones could take the ball on the full run from an inbounds play, 3 dribbles and go dunking on the other end. That's the legend of Kurt Jones.
There is no known footage that still exists of Curtis Jones playing basketball. No movies, no video, no old games from TV. Nothing. So all we're left with are the memories of those who were lucky enough to see him play.
He was in his comeback day when I seen him in the middle school, and he got on the floor and just put on a spectacular show. I mean, he was, I guess you would say today's Isaiah Thomas, doing things that people had never seen, dribble with one finger, throwing no-look passes, and everything was right on the money.
He might have been 5'11", or maybe 5'11 and a half, and he weighed nothing, he was skinny. But he just had a way, the ball was on a string, and he had this court vision. He was a basketball genius is what he really was. And they had good players with him, of course, but those guys knew if they got open, they're getting it. One thing I always learned just being a guard, if you don't throw it to the guys, they stop running the floor. Well, nobody stopped running the floor at Northwestern High School because they knew one way or the other, just make a good cut and they're going to be laying it up.
And I was a little kid. That's what made it awesome, because everything's bigger, faster, stronger when you're a little kid. And I just remember that he could really shoot the ball, and he was really cat quick. And it seemed like, wow, this guy's playing at St. Cecilia. Like, I know he could be playing somewhere in the college or the pros. He's that good.
I went to McKenzie High School. And so I'm at McKenzie High School. Northwestern and McKenzie are playing in a West Side Championship game. And McKenzie's ahead in the game by a basket with a minute to play. They call a timeout. Northwestern calls a timeout. They come back out on the floor. They bring the ball up. And McKenzie traps Kurt Jones, who then threw the pass out of the trap, hit his teammate in the head with it, caught the pass back off his teammate's head, made a layup to put them ahead by 1. So McKenzie gets the ball back with 28 seconds. They go down. They get Northwestern stops them. They get a rebound. They give it to Kurt Jones. He dribbled the clock out. He was, they couldn't catch him. They couldn't trap him. They couldn't stop him. And they win the game. It was the most unbelievable thing that I'd ever seen. Of the players that I watched play, guys I actually watched play, Curtis Jones had more basketball talent than anybody I ever saw play.
It doesn't take anything from the George Gervins or the Magic Johnsons. I think they're great ball players. But the things that Curtis would do with the ball, I wouldn't even see the Globetrotters. The Globetrotters, he was so entertaining, and you look at the Globetrotters, a lot of that is rehearsed. He would do that in a serious situation. And I would tell guys, I said, if your job is to guard Curtis, do not take your mother or your girlfriend to the game, because you're going to get embarrassed.
Underneath all the basketball greatness, though, was the sad fact that Curtis Jones was totally illiterate. He was allowed to graduate from Northwestern High School in 1968, even though he couldn't read his own diploma. After that, he was actually able to enroll in college, even though he couldn't write his own name. In the fall of 1968, Curtis landed a scholarship to attend school and play basketball on the other side of the country, at a school in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho called North Idaho Junior College. This was about as far from Detroit as you could get, in every way. A tiny town in Idaho, on the edge of the Rocky Mountains. As a player at North Idaho, Curtis would be playing for a local icon named Raleigh Williams. Curtis's game might have been ready for Division I, but his grades weren't. The idea was that Curtis would spend a couple of years at North Idaho, and then become eligible to transfer to a bigger school. Curtis later said that Fred Snowden, his coach at Northwestern, who was now an assistant at the University of Michigan, promised him a spot playing for the Wolverines if he kept his grades up.
I don't know for sure if he was told by Coach Snowden that he's coming to Michigan, but we did hear stuff like that. And those of us who are from Detroit or the Detroit area used to scratch our heads a little bit and say, unless he's changed in a year and a half, 2 years, how's he going to do the schoolwork at the University of Michigan? So I believe he was told that. I don't see why he would lie about it.
Curtis Jones didn't make much of a splash during his first year at North Idaho, but as a sophomore he began to take over games. In this game against Columbia Basin, he scored 30 points, leading his red-hot team to a win. But sometime in the spring of 1970, Curtis Jones' world began to collapse. After a year and a half of somehow faking his way through classes, the students and teachers at North Idaho finally caught on to the fact that Curtis couldn't read. Years later, in a 1980 interview with the Detroit Free Press, he recounted the situation. "I didn't even have to go to class. I cheated. I got by. I can converse with anybody, but in my last year on campus, everybody found out I couldn't read. It became a joke. It was a small campus, and everywhere I went, people would hand me books I couldn't read. They would have given $1 million for my basketball ability, but I needed what they had, the ability to read a book."
Everybody always said, the word in the street always was, and nobody ever said it in a disparaging way, but people said he was illiterate. He couldn't read and write. And I didn't know if it was true or not, but it was said enough, that that's what you heard. And he went off to junior college in Idaho. And, we're in Detroit, playing in the Big Ten. You don't even know where Idaho is.
So Curtis left the North Idaho campus and returned to Detroit. He had become a legend at St. Cecilia, but once his basketball skills started to fade away, his life began to spiral out of control. Curtis started receiving treatment for mental problems at the state hospital in Northville, as he finally came to grips with the fact that his basketball dreams were dead and gone.
It was just unfortunate that things turned out the way it did for Curtis, because he couldn't accept the fact. His dream and his goal was, to continue to play basketball at the collegiate level and then in the pro level. And that didn't work out for him, and it was tough for him to deal with.
In 1982, he found himself back in the headlines for a very different reason. With the help of a lawyer in Detroit, Curtis filed a landmark $15 million lawsuit against the Detroit Public Schools, North Idaho Junior College, and the University of Michigan. He said that they exploited his basketball talents for their own gain, without any thought of getting him an education. In the lawsuit, Curtis blamed them for the fact that he couldn't read and write. It was the first time in history that an athlete had sued his old school district for failing to educate him.
And what he contended, the way I understand it, was that he was essentially shuffled along through school by the Detroit Public School System, by the junior college, and then that was the end of his schooling. And he contended that he'd been promised by Coach Snowden that he was going to just go to junior college and then he could come to Michigan. And he contended, the lawsuit contended, that he was entitled to damages because they had essentially ruined his life. by not requiring him to do the work that everybody else had to do. And part of what they were arguing was the only reason he was able to even be passed through the grade school, junior high, and high school was because he was a great basketball player.
But after several years of bouncing around the court system, Curtis Jones eventually lost his lawsuit. He never got a dime. Throughout the years, people who knew Curtis have continued to use his story to educate others. This is what happens, they say, when you have all the basketball talent in the world, but you don't have an education.
I use Curtis all the time when I talk to my team and my players, because a lot of times they would always ask me, they say, Coach, who would you play against? You played against Spencer Haywood, you played against Curtis Jones, and I would always tell them the Curtis Jones story. Yeah, it's definitely a lesson, especially if we can explain to them how good this guy was, and without the education, his dreams weren't realized.
Curtis Jones never worked a day in his life. Even as a grown man, the greatest basketball player Detroit has ever known lived in a small bedroom in his mother's basement. Curtis Jones died on March 14, 1999, at the age of 49, a broken man in every way. His mother Henrietta was devastated, telling a reporter, "All of Kurt's dreams died with him. He had great dreams." And then she added, "No other kid has to go through this. There's hope for kids who are illiterate. They can be helped." When you stop by Curtis Jones' house on McGraw Street today, this is what you'll find. It's empty and abandoned and broken down, just like the dreams of the basketball legend who once lived there. In 2011, Jalen Rose opened a public charter school in Northwest Detroit called the Jalen Rose Leadership Academy. It's a high school that features a longer school day and a longer school year as it prepares its students for college. Jalen Rose, the kid who grew up watching Curtis Jones play basketball, says that Curtis's sad, tragic story was one of the driving forces for him wanting to start the school.
Here's a young man that had a lot of talent, but he wasn't really being educated by the Detroit public school system. So he's one of the people that I think about as I walk through the halls of JRLA every day, because I feel like a system failed a player and or a person like Curtis Jones.
There's a basketball team at the Jalen Rose Leadership Academy, and ironically enough, they play their home games at St. Cecilia's, on the same court where Curtis Jones became a legend more than 4 decades ago. The team is filled with players who are just like Curtis Jones in many ways. Detroit kids who love basketball. Detroit kids who have big dreams. One of those players is Aubrey Williams, who graduated from the Jalen Rose Leadership Academy in 2015. Aubrey Williams has a lot in common with Curtis Jones. Just like Curtis, he's from Detroit. Just like Curtis, he lives to play basketball. And just like Curtis, he's playing in front of cheering crowds at St. Cecilia's. The one big difference, though, is that unlike Curtis Jones, Aubrey knows that his dreams won't go anywhere without an education.
I've been playing basketball since I was in the 6th grade. After that, I made the team, kind of felt like, okay, this is what I really want to do. I like this sport. I'm kind of good at it. Because you don't know really what's going to happen. You can get injured. You don't know really what's, you need a backup plan any moment. So education, you always can fall back on education. So it really pushes me to do well in school. It's kind of like education first. Actually, Mr. Rose, he makes sure he asks us about education when he sees us before anything. How are we doing in school? How can he help? What's going on? Like stuff like that. Then he asks about basketball. He doesn't ask about how the sport's going first.
And that's where the story of Curtis Jones offers some hope. Just like Curtis's mother said, no other kid has to go through this. True, no other kid has to go through life without learning to read. No other kid has to go through life without getting an education. No other kid has to go through this.
I remember being a student that was pretty good at school, but was terrible with my behavior and my citizenship. You know what my mother did? She took me off the basketball team. I don't have to put you on punishment. You can go outside and play with your friends, but you're not gonna play on the basketball team. And so when she did that, she took basketball from me. That allowed me to take what I was doing in school a lot more serious. And that's what we owe to the students here. We're gonna put your academics first, your social and your life skills, your etiquette, your decision making, your problem solving. These are all things that go into a successful individual that just happens to have the talent to play a sport. See, the answer is put academics first, second. And all of a sudden, playing a sport or being a part of a club or being a part of an activity becomes a reward.
The people who should know say that Curtis Jones had more basketball talent than anyone from Detroit ever. More than Chris Webber. More than Spencer Haywood. More than George Gervin. More than all of them.
It reminded me of the story when Isaiah was here and he had that 16 points in 2 minutes, remember, against the Knicks? And we lost. The Pistons lost. And they interviewed Rory Sparrow afterward, and this really applies to Kurt. And they said, you know, that Isaiah Thomas, is it this? Is it this? Is it natural this? And Rory Sparrow cut him off. No. He said, you guys got it wrong. One day, God was bored. And he looked down in Chicago, and he said, that guy. That's how Kurt was. That's what the guy was. He was just unique unto himself. God looked and said, that guy.
Back in the day, this kid was a legend. This kid had all the basketball talent in the world. Just imagine what might have happened if this kid had also gotten an education.